Thank you so much for continuing to listen to American Medicine Today. I'm joined by Ethan Euchre.
Happy to be here.
Yes, Jeff Wagstaff.
Hello, everyone.
Hello. And world-renowned orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Alfred Bonatti. So we recently observed the 100th anniversary of the devastating flu pandemic of 1918 that killed millions of people around the globe. Joining us to discuss is Dr. Jeremy Brown, author of Influenza, the 100-year hunt to cure the deadliest disease in history. Thank you for being here, Jeremy.
Oh, thank you for having me on the show, Kimberly.
Yes.
Yeah, so give us a recap of this great flu pandemic. Didn't they call it the Spanish flu? It was in 1918. Sort of where did it begin? Where did it spread to? How many people were affected?
Sure. So we are commemorating, as you said, the 100th anniversary of this awful flu pandemic. We believe started either in Haskell County in Kansas or possibly in France. Another theory is that it began actually in China. By the time it was over, somewhere between 50 and 100 million people had died across the world. Wow. In the U.S., the death toll was 675,000 people. And if that proportion of people were to be killed in a flu pandemic today in the U.S., you're talking about upwards of 3 million deaths.
Why do you think it was such a terribly deadly strain? I mean, it doesn't seem like it could be possible.
One of the features of its deadliness was the fact that although flu usually attacks the very young and the elderly, they're the two populations usually most at risk. This particular virus, the 1918 virus, was especially deadly for young, healthy adults. And nobody to this day really understands why that was. There are a number of theories. One is that this virus did something to interferon, which is an important part of our immune system, and prevented interferons from working properly in the lungs, so it somehow damaged the immune response in the lung. A second theory was that it was actually nothing to do with the influenza virus itself. Most of the deaths were due to secondary bacterial infections that would follow influenza, and of course today we thankfully have antibiotics to combat those infections, which they didn't have back then. A third theory is that there was something called a cytokine storm. Somehow the influenza virus revved up the immune system in places, and that caused the immune system to actually attack the body itself.
But why is it 100 years later, influenza still kills over 30,000 people a year in the U.S.?
That's right. It's a disease that we think of as both very familiar. It's something that we've all probably experienced sometime or another, or helped a family member who's had the flu. And in the overwhelming majority of cases, the vast majority of cases, it is simply that. It's simply an illness that is going to knock us out for a couple of days, and then we will slowly get better from it. Right. But you're correct that we are still puzzled by the fact that this disease can be so unremarkable in some people, and yet deadly in others. Now, we know certain groups are more affected. The young, the elderly are at special risk. Pregnant women are also at a higher risk of complications of flu, as are people with chronic lung illnesses. Those are some of the classic at-risk groups. But as we've heard from the headlines recently, this disease can strike otherwise healthy young people. And it still remains, therefore, a very, very important question for us to answer.
We've also interviewed people from the CDC that talk about the vaccinations, the different shots, the Tamiflu, all those things, and basically it's kind of a crapshoot.
At its very best, the flu vaccine is only 50% effective. Last year it was probably around 30% effective. Flu is a very tricky virus to deal with. It's constantly one step ahead of us. And because it can mutate so very quickly into different strains, we're always trying to play catch up. We can vaccinate against a strain that we think is going to be present in a flu season, and it turns out that a completely different strain was there. So we're always trying to catch up with the flu, and that's why the vaccine to this day is still not really any more than about 50% effective.
Jeremy, I have a question for you. Maybe you can help us debunk an old wives' tale. I was always told and heard that some people catch the disease that they're being immune from. When you get the shots, I got the anti-flu shot. And I have never been, I always thought the flu was kind of like a bad cold. After I got my shot, I ended up a few days later getting the flu. It turned into the swine flu. I've never been so sick in my life. I felt like I was dying. I thought the flu, like I said, was a mild.
Yeah.
My wife and I both ended up with it. And I truly believe
Are
it was...
you glad you got the shot?
No, and
that's the cause, I think.
I've been afraid to get the shot ever since. Now, people have said, my general practitioner has said, It's impossible for you to get it. But I've never been that sick in my life, and I only got it after I got the shot.
First of all, you cannot get the flu from an influenza vaccine that does not contain an active, or we'll call it a live influenza virus. And the majority of shots, the influenza shots that are given, contain a virus that is not active. So there is no way that you can catch the flu from that. Now, there is another form of the influenza vaccine that is given nasally, and that contains an attenuated virus. In other words, it's still, let's call it alive. It's still alive, but in a much weaker form. And there is, in that group of vaccines, actually a remote possibility of catching the flu from that. But those vaccines, those live attenuated vaccines, are not the ones that are typically given. The flu shot contains no active influenza virus from which you can become ill. So what happened to you? Well, a couple of things. You may have actually gotten the influenza shot and then gone ahead and caught the disease that was circulating at the time, just out of sheer chance. And of course, that's going to happen, isn't it? When you vaccinate tens of millions of people, some of them are going to get ill in the next couple of days because they were already developing the virus. You may have had a reaction to the influenza virus itself, but to bring this back, I think that the suggestion that you can become ill from influenza when you get the influenza shot is something we have to be very clear about. That cannot happen.
You talk about it in the book. What happened when Japan stopped making vaccines mandatory?
So this was an incredible natural experiment. That in Japan, the flu vaccine for children was mandatory. And then in the 90s, there was some pushback against that. And the vaccine stopped being mandatory for school-aged children. What they then saw in Japan was a remarkable rise in the number of deaths amongst the elderly. The elderly population, a population that had no change in how it was vaccinated. And this natural experiment really underlines the importance of getting children vaccinated, because we all know that children are little petri dishes, they
filthy
carry all
animals.
Kinds of germs.
They're just little germ carriers.
Yeah.
And when they climb on grandma with the flu that they picked up from one of their playmates in kindergarten, it's grandma who's going to suffer. So this experiment, and this natural experiment in Japan, really demonstrated the fact that it's very important for young children to get the vaccine.
I was going to say, maybe the vaccine should really be offered just to the elderly if their immune systems are worse because they are more fragile and older, and leave the youngsters to build up their own immunity.
Right.
Yeah, so you've hit upon something that I talk about in the book, and this is the difference between the vaccine policy in the United States and in places like Europe and Great Britain. In Great Britain, the flu vaccine is only suggested for the very young, the elderly, I said, and those who are, as we said, at high risk.
Okay.
And that other huge body of people, the young, healthy adults, young, let's say between 18 and 50, 55. In the UK, that group has not been the group that is recommended to get the vaccine. We tend to think of the flu vaccine here as something that everybody should get, and in the UK, it's really targeted for special high-risk groups. The truth of the matter is that the complication rates in both countries are about the same. And in otherwise healthy adults, the influenza vaccine has a minimal effect. It reduces the rate from somewhere from 2% to a little bit around 1%. So it does reduce the rate, but overall it's a very minimal effect. Let's just make it very clear to people. High-risk groups should certainly be vaccinated each year.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jeremy Brown, author of Influenza, the 100-Year Hunt to Cure the Deadliest Disease in History. Thank you for shedding some light on this for us.
You're most welcome.
Take
Have a great
care.
one. Bye-bye.